Yeah, start.
All right. So, good morning, everybody. Today we are doing chapter 4 of Peter Hall's Cities of Tomorrow. And this chapter is called The City in the Garden. So, I trust that you have all read the chapter. Have you?
Yes.
How
Yes?
many?
Okay. Has everybody read it and read the whole thing?
You can raise hands.
Yeah. You can raise hands. So, you'll give us a sense of how many people have read. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Was it easy enough to understand?
Was it
Yeah.
all right? So can someone talk about it a little, just to give a overall sense of what the chapter is about, and then we'll start with the reading.
Yeah. I can go on.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Basically, the story of Garden City started from the London. So in 1900 to 19.
Hello, we lost you. Yadvendra, we lost you. You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So the Garden Cities are basically started in London, Paris, Berlin, and New York City. It's basically from 1900 to 1940. So the idealist way that how the state control is, uh, so the green city is one of the example of how the idealist way that the state control the city. Uh, and this is after the rise of suburbanization in 1800 18th century. So in response to the poor and labor force, the formation of labor colonies. So the idea was to have a land nationalization uh, of cooperative purchase, towns having limited population, surrounding with agricultural belts, etc. One movement which is listed is back to the land movement, which is. So can we explain that land movement wala part? Hello.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We're listening.
So the idea which come was the town country. The main points
Mhm.
was freedom and
Hello, Yadvendra. You can't hear you.
Is he line or stop?
slow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Now we can hear.
yeah. The beauty of nature, low rents, low prices, pure air, no slums, the flow of capital, good drainage. So these are some like the criteria. So the action of purchasing land together also helps the poor or the blue collar working class people, so that the load won't come on individual shoulder. So it will be like a community based purchasing. So this was neither the capitalism or neither the socialism. Time putting part
We lost you again.
supporting the yeah. Now is it audible?
Yeah, now it's better.
Yeah. The foundation for the garden city was the Letchworth. So the Letchworth city, which is outside London. So they
Mm.
also grew.
Lost him again.
Mm. You're muted. Yadvendra, you're mute again.
Yeah, yeah. So the foundation was for the first garden city was in Perth, which is in London. outside London. So over they had similar things, the land, uh, it was with housing. I select the smaller next to like with the green belt. That's industrial part little away from.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's
Hmm.
the basic what I got from the
Okay.
agriculture.
Okay. Good. Okay. Good. Anybody else wants to chip in? Okay. So, as probably you guessed from some of the earlier discussions in the earlier classes, the garden city idea is actually a reaction to the 18th and 19th century industrial city, and it comes out of a way of thinking about how can the human environment be improved to mitigate some of the disastrous conditions that were created mainly due to the rise of industrial development in urban areas. And some of the, if you've read the novels of Charles Dickens and so on, you will probably have got a sense of what urban life at that point was like, apart from, uh, urban slums. There was, incredible amount of environmental pollution. Cities were always described as living in industrial cities was described as living in smoke-filled, hellish environments. And so this created a whole reaction, a social, economic, and professional reaction to the problem of or problems of life. And so if you go to the chapter and if you start reading along with me, I'll read the first, um, uh, ditty by William Morris, who's writing in the Earthly Paradise. He says, "Forget counties overhung with smoke. Forget the snorting steam and piston stroke. Forget the spreading of the hideous town. Think rather of the pack horse on the down, and dream of London small, white, and clean, the clear Thames bordered by its gardens green. Let every dawn of morning be to you as the beginning of life, and every setting sun be to you as its close. And then let every one of these short lives leave its sure record of some kindly thing done for others, some goodly strength or knowledge gained for yourself. So from day to day and strength to strength, you shall build up indeed by art, by thought, and by just will, an ecclesia of England, of which it shall not be said, see what manner of stones are here, but see what manner of men. This is John Ruskin, who incidentally was one of uh, uh, someone who inspired Mahatma Gandhi. Um, so this chapter is the Garden City. It's subtitled The Garden City Solution, London, Paris, Berlin, New York, from 1900 to 1940. Uh, it is invidious, but it needs saying. Despite doughty competition, Ebenezer Howard is the most important single character in this entire tale. So it is important to get him right, even though almost everyone has got him wrong. His many self-appointed critics have, at one time or another, been wrong about almost everything he stood for. They called him a planner, a term of derogation, whereas he earned his living as a shorthand writer. They said he had advocated low-density prairie planning. In fact, his garden city would have had densities like inner London, which, so later planners once came to believe, needed high-rise towers to make them work. They confused his garden city with the garden suburb found at Hampstead and in numerous imitations, though it must be confessed one of his principal lieutenants, Raymond Unwin, was originally to blame for that. They still think that he wanted to consign people into small towns isolated in the deep countryside, which actually he proposed, while he actually proposed the planning of conurbations with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people. They accuse him of wanting to move people around like pawns on a chessboard, whereas in fact, he dreamed of voluntary self-governing communities. Most mistakenly of them of all, they see him as a physical planner, ignoring the fact that his garden cities were merely the vehicles for a progressive reconstruction of capitalist society into an infinity of cooperative commonwealth. They cannot claim that he made it difficult for them. In his 78 years, he wrote only one book, and a slim one at that. First published in 1898 under the title Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, it was reissued in 1902 with the title Garden Cities of Tomorrow. This was perhaps catchier, but it diverted people from the truly radical character of the message, demoting him from social visionary to physical planner. Sources of Howard's ideas. Better to appreciate Howard's contribution, he must be set against the background of his time. He developed his ideas in the London of the 1880s and 1890s, the age of radical ferment, described in Chapter 1. An eclectic thinker, he borrowed freely from the ideas that were circulating at the time. But there were other earlier influences. Born in the city of London in 1850, a fact commemorated by a plaque at the edge of the huge Barbican redevelopment, which almost certainly he would have not liked at all. He grew up in a small country towns in southern and eastern England, Sudbury, Switch, Chestnut. At 21, he emigrated to America and became a pioneer in Nebraska, where he met Buffalo Bill, but proved a disaster as a farmer. From 1872 to 1876, he was in Chicago, beginning the career as a shorthand writer that he was to follow all his life. We know little about these years, but they must have been important to him. As a farmer on the frontier, personal experience with the Homestead Act of 1862, which opened up the prairies and the plains to pioneers free of charge, thus establishing an economy and society of prosperous farms and small towns, an educational system devoted to technical improvement in agriculture and the mechanical arts. Then, as a resident of Chicago, he saw the city's great rebuilding after the fire of 1871. Still, in these pre-skyscraper days, it was universally known as the Garden City, the almost certain source of Howard's better-known title. He must have seen the new garden suburb of Riverside, designed by the great landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, arising on the Des Plaines River 9 miles outside the city. Howard always denied that he found his inspiration in Chicago, but the broad outlines of the idea must have originated here. Here too he found the idea of the planned city in a pamphlet of 1876, Benjamin Ward Richardson's Hygeia, or the City of Health. His main ideas, low population density, good housing, wide roads, an underground railway, and plenty of open space, all found their way into the garden city concept. Back in Britain, he settled himself and his family in a cramped home in a boring street in Newton, and began in earnest to think and read. A huge agricultural depression was forcing thousands of land into the city, above all the London slums. He joined a free-thinking debate society, technical city, inclusive worked around New West, with two new terms. Later in the book, he was adamant that he had thought of a central idea himself, but he had then found other ideas who supplied the details. But there was certainly plenty from Herbert Spencer, the idea of and then uh, can you all mute your mic because there's somebody's mic is on. Somebody raised their hand.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you actually because there was some sound coming.
Yeah, just everybody please turn off your mic. now everybody's off. Okay. Later in the book, he was adamant that he had thought out all the central ideas.
Hussain?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
can you guys? So I think what Hussein is reading now is the various influences in terms of, I mean, for the people who couldn't hear. So this section of the essay deals with all, because although the garden city is very much Ebenezer Howard's idea, and the way he formulated it, has clearly been influenced by different things that he experienced, including the Homestead Act, his experience in America, his experience as a resident of Chicago. And so this section goes on with all the various things that led to the emergence of this idea. Hussein, do you want to just start reading from, like, I think it's better that they read this part themselves. Can you go to page 91, the economist Alfred Marshall, in an article
That's
of
page,
1884?
that's page 94 in the PDF, all right?
Yes.
So, Purva, page 94.
Yeah. Can everyone hear Hussein now? Because even I couldn't hear him earlier.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. The economist Alfred Marshall, in an article of 1884, had suggested the idea that there were large classes of the population of London whose removal into the country would, in the long run, be economically advantageous, that it would benefit alike those who moved and those who remained behind. His reasoning had been that the new technologies would permit this dispersal, an idea taken up by the anarchist Peter Kropotkin in his Fields, Factories, and Workshops of 1898, which certainly influenced Ebenezer Howard. And Marshall even suggested the mechanism. The general plan would be for a committee, whether specifically formed for the purpose or not, to interest themselves in the formation of a colony in some place well beyond the range of London smoke. After seeing their way to buying or building suitable cottages there, they would enter into communication with some of the employees of low wage labor. That idea, adopted with enthusiasm by Ebenezer Howard, was based on a critical assumption, as Robert Fishman has pointed out, that workers could find steady employment in a small self contained city distant from the metropolis. That proved a prophetic assumption for much of the following century. But entering the 21st century, we have returned to the chaotic, flexible job patterns of the 1890s. Charles Booth, wrestling with the problem of his Class B poor, the crux of the social problem, had a paternalistic version of the same answer: to withdraw them from the labor force by the formation of labor colonies, an extension of the poor law outside London. My idea is that these people should be allowed to live as families in industrial groups planted wherever land and building materials were cheap, being well housed, well fed, and well warmed, and taught and trained, and employed from morning to night on work, indoors or out, for themselves or on government account, in the building of their own dwellings, in the cultivation of the land, in the making of clothes, or in the making of furniture. That in exchange for the work done, the government should supply materials and whatever else was needed. Booth admitted that this solution was
Can you
draconian.
stop there? Sen?
Yeah,
Yeah, you can stop there. Could you just explain this paragraph?
The Charles Booth paragraph.
Yeah,
the
Kropotkin and the.
Okay, so one of the I mean, also just going back to the introductory paragraph that I just read. Um, uh, Peter Hall begins by explaining how Ebenezer Howard is a highly misunderstood individual in the history of planning. In fact, a lot of people, I mean, even today, when you talk about garden cities, the Ebenezer Howard's diagram is presented, and we'll show you the diagram. And it is almost assumed by planners, architects, urban designers that what Ebenezer Howard was talking about was actually a plan for a city. But as Peter Hall explains, it was never meant to be a plan. It was actually a diagram, and it was actually a concept. Ebenezer Howard was not really a planner. He was actually a social visionary He was more of a political radical, as you can call him, who actually thought about the problem of cities. But he didn't say or he didn't suggest that cities should be designed as large concentric circles, with small towns scattered everywhere and so forth. His idea were more abstract than a physical plan would suggest. So he's highly misunderstood, and the reason for the misunderstandings are many. I mean, generally, as from our own tendencies as architects and planners and designers, that we tend to take what is diagrammatized quite literally often, and we misunderstand the connection of ideas as the arrangements in space, which is actually not what he was trying to do. All right. Um, an important thing to understand about Ebenezer Howard was he was influenced by people who did not do plans. One of the persons who inspired him was Peter Kropotkin, who was actually a naturalist, a geographer, a naturalist, who was I mean, was a political radical all his life. He wrote lots of books and pamphlets on social reform and social revolution. And one of his books is called Fields, Factories, and Workshops, which is probably the only thing Kropotkin has written about the way in which space should be organized. And this book, Fields, Factories, and Workshops, actually articulates a social vision, which tries to think about how can a society become a move from a capitalist mode of production, a system where um, uh, you know um uh, 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 the exploitation of nature, the domination of human beings, and the pursuit of profit can be transformed into a world where people and even the division of labor, where some people do all the intellectual work, whereas the mass of humanity does manual work. This kind of artificial division of labor was also for Peter Kropotkin a problem. And what he suggested was that an ideal life would be one where everybody did both manual work and intellectual work, and shared these responsibilities with other people as equals. And so, if you begin with that assumption, how would how would you live? So his social vision involved thinking about scattered communities, more or less independent and interdependent, where people would work in small workshops. They would have educational facilities, health facilities. They would do they would part of the day they would work in the field. Part of the day they would work in factories, and most of their life they would spend in the midst of nature in leisure. And this was the kind of imagination that drove Peter Kropotkin to write that book. And this was what inspired Ebenezer Howard. Now, the what Ebenezer Howard did is he thought about this deeply, and he, in fact, proposed a way of thinking about um, uh, the problem of the city, and he suggested how Peter Kropotkin's vision could be realized in an urban setting. Now, obviously, the industrial city was completely alienated from nature. So, what Ebenezer Howard proposed is a way of bringing together the best of country life and the best of city life into a synthesis, which is what he called the garden city. Notice there's nothing here that talks about parks, there's nothing here that talks about bylaws, there's nothing here that talks about the highways or freeways or anything like that. It was basically an abstract idea about social organization, not about physical organization. Hmm? So this is something that we have to immediately understand about Ebenezer Howard and clear up this misunderstandings that have accumulated over the century about his ideas. All right. Okay, Shweta, what's next paragraph?
What what Peter Hall is trying to say in the introduction, that he's being misunderstood and people think of him as a physical planner and not the social visionary that he was. And what garden cities were meant to be was a complete reconstruction of our society, the capitalist society as we know it, into these kinds of multiple cooperative commonwealth. And but somehow people still understand that diagram as a form, so architects are obsessed with form, and when we look at the diagram we think it's radiating roads and it's these green belts and these small clusters of towns, but that's not exactly that's not all it was, and that's not exactly how he had imagined it. So what he points out is that the title, earlier the title of his publication was Tomorrow, a Peaceful Path to Real Reform, which meant reconstruction of society. But when it was reissued in 1902, they changed the title to Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which focused more on the physical aspects of his ideas, not really on the social aspects. All right, so I think then let's move on to page 92 in my book. Uh, by the end of the 1880s, Howard had all the ideas he needed.
By the end of the page, what in your book?
92, by the
90.
end of the 1880s, Howard had all the ideas he needed.
Ah, all right. So this is page 95 in the PDF. Yeah, got it. By the end of the 1880s, Howard had all the ideas he needed, but he could not bring them together. The real key was Edward Bellamy's best-selling science fiction novel Looking Backward, which he read early in 1888, shortly after its American publication. He personally testified to the influence it had on him. He began to talk about his ideas to the more progressive London sect, at least from 1892. Every single one of Howard's ideas can thus, in fact, be found earlier, often several times over. Ledo, Owen, Pemberton, Buckingham, and Kropotkin all had towns of limited populations with surrounding agricultural greenbelts. More, Saint-Simon, Fourier, all had cities as elements in a regional complex. Marshall and Kropotkin saw the impact of technological development on industrial location, and Kropotkin and Edward Bellamy also appreciated that it would come to favor small-scale workshops. But Howard, attracted as he was to Bellamy's looking backward, rejected his centralized socialist management and his insistence on a subordination of the individual to the group, which he saw as authoritarian. His biographer, Robert Beavers, points out that all these major influences came from the English dissenting tradition. None, save Kropotkin, were continental Europeans. More widely, Howard could not fail to be influenced by the Back to the Land movement, which, fueled by urban growth and urban squalor, agricultural depression, nostalgia, quasi-religious motives, anti-Victorian conventions, flourished among the intelligentsia between 1880 and 1914, a genuine alternative movement similar in many respects to such movements in 1960s and 1970s. At least 28 such 19th century communities can be traced, all but 5 or 6 of which were rural. Their inhabitants included utopian socialists, agrarian socialists, sectarians, and anarchists. Few survived for long, though sometimes their settlements do. Shweta, you have to pronounce this.
Transmogrify. Yeah, that's
trans,
going to
trans,
come 3 times. Yeah, the word.
yeah, it's
It means
transmogrify.
to transform magically, or kind of with an element of surprise, like something that you wouldn't expect. Yeah, that's transmogrify, which he uses several times in this chapter.
Yeah, transmogrified. Heron's Gate, established by the Chartists in Hertfordshire after the failure of their political demands in 1848, is today a smart stockbroker community next to the M25 motorway. Behind these manifestations lay a much wider movement, well represented by such writers as Morris and Ruskin, which aim to reject the grosser trappings of industrialization and to return to a simpler life based on craft and community. So, as Howard wrote, the idea of community building was everywhere in the air.
Yeah, you can stop there. So here he refers to the back to the land movement. So that was also the part of the Romantic movement, which was a reaction to the, the pollution and the squalor and the destruction of nature that was brought about by the Industrial Revolution. And it was influenced by many Romantic thinkers, including Morris and Ruskin, who advocated a movement back to land, closer to nature. And many communities of people then in fact moved out of cities and began to live in smaller communities. And like he said, these included utopian socialists, agrarians, socialists, sectarians, and anarchists. And this movement was also, like it has been described by Ramchandra Guha, as one of the movements of the environmental movement. It was also the beginnings of the environmental movement, which was a reaction to the destruction of nature and environmental destruction brought about by the Industrial Revolution. So what he talks about is that people wanted to return not just to nature, but also to return to a more primitive form of life where they lived in smaller towns or settlements and leaded a much simpler, quieter life based on craft and community. Would you like to add to that, Hussain?
No, I think that's fine. So one thing that at one point he, in fact, Ebenezer Howard was also worried about the broader tendencies in the socialist movement, in the state socialist movement, the people associated with state communism, who placed the individual, who actually subsumed the individual within the community. And for people like Howard and the anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, who influenced him, this was something which was a form of authoritarianism. So it was so while this Ebenezer Howard's ideas were a reaction to capitalist exploitation, he also did not agree with the way in which, in some strands of the socialist movement, there was an advocacy of state control over society. And so much of this Garden City idea was inspired by a kind of a cooperative socialism, which meant that people would live in communities, not uh, not in completely nationalized or state-controlled societies, but in self-determined societies, societies where people have control over their own lives, in kind of a radical democratization of society, where people live in small communities in a cooperative way, and these are linked with other cooperative structures to create a certain kind of cooperative socialism. So it was a reaction to both statism and to capitalism at the same time, right? So that is what differentiated the anarchists from the state socialists and the capitalists, right? So this is where this is one thing that one has to understand, and Peter Hall points this out in the introduction to this book as well, that some of the most interesting and progressive strands of the planning movement actually come from the anarchists, who spoke about ways in which people can determine their own lives and not be subordinated to the state, nor be subordinated to the market system, right?
Do you want to explain a bit about the anarchists, or like just in case people?
It'll come. When we talk about Geddes and all of that, I think this will get elaborated more.
All right. So I'll read the next section. However, I would like to point out, so we're coming to the description of the garden city and the social city and what, Howard really envisioned. But I'd also like to remind you of the previous chapter, the chapter that we read last week, which was the city of bypass variegated. And there we talked about this kind of speculative entrepreneurial development. Even that was a kind of reaction to the 18th and 19th century city, where there was this kind of suburbanization and sprawl out, where people began to move out of cities in communities outside cities. But that was significantly different from the way Howard was talking about it, because he has a certain, he imagines a certain structure and imagines an alternative society. So as we read this, just try and recollect and compare it to what we read last week. Should I start reading, Hussain?
Yeah. Where are you reading from? The Garden City and the Social
So
City?
now I'm just continuing from where Hussain left off, the garden city and the social city. All right. The ingredients were far from original. What Howard would claim and did in a chapter heading claim was that his was a unique combination of proposals. He started with the famous diagram of the three magnets. Today, it has archaic charm, particularly in the colored version of the first edition, but it packs onto one page a set of complex arguments that would take far more space to say in modern jargon. The Victorian slum city, to be sure, was in many ways a horrific place, but it offered economic and social opportunities, lights, and crowds. The late Victorian countryside, now too seen in a sentimental glow, was in fact equally unprepossessing. Though it promised fresh air and nature, it was racked by agricultural depression and it offered neither sufficient work and wages nor adequate social life. But it was possible to square the circle by combining the best of town and country in a new kind of settlement, town country. To achieve this, a group of people, necessarily including several with commercial competence and credibility, should establish a limited dividend company, borrowing money to establish a garden city in the countryside, far enough from the city to ensure that land was bought at rock bottom, depressed agricultural land values. They should get agreement from leading industrialists to move their factories there. Their workers would move too and would build their own houses. The garden city would have a fixed limit. Howard suggested 32,000 people living on 1,000 acres of land, about 1.5 times the historic medieval city of London. It would be surrounded by a much larger area of permanent green belt, also owned by the company. Howard proposed 5,000 acres containing not merely farms, but also all kinds of urban institutions like reformatories and convalescent homes that could benefit from a rural location. As more and more people moved out, the garden city would reach its planned limit. Another would start Then another would start a short distance away. Thus, over time, there would develop a vast planned agglomeration, expanding almost without limit. Within it, each garden city would offer a wide range of jobs and services, but each would also be connected to the others by a rapid transit system, or as Howard called it, an intermunicipal railway, thus giving all the economic and social opportunities of the giant city. Howard called this polycentric vision social city. Because the diagram was truncated in the second and subsequent editions, most readers have failed to understand that this, not the individual garden city, was the physical realization of town country, the third magnet. Hussain, can you just show them the slides in the
Yeah,
presentation? Like, can you
yeah.
switch to the diagram?
Can you see my screen? Okay. All right. Start. 1 second. Okay. Can you see the screen now?
Can everyone see the screen?
Shweta, you can see?
Yeah, I can see.
So I guess everybody will be able to see it then. Okay, so this is the larger diagram of the garden city, of the conurbation actually, because this has multiple cities within it, all connected with a central garden city. And as you can see that there are, as a diagram, it is organized as concentric circles, but obviously you know that no city can be planned in this manner unless you're going to do incredible amount of violence on land. This as a diagram, what it talks about is these multiple garden cities, all organized and interconnected with the intermunicipal canal and railway system. Um, and it and as you keep multiplying this kind of a hexagonal grid on the landscape, you see the garden city conurbation growing. The idea is that it, in a way, moves away from the kind of the centralized large city formation that was very much a part of the way in which urbanization was taking place, and by providing a certain kind of a barrier, which is green belts or a kind of a population limit, you would ensure that when the city has to grow, it would grow as smaller garden city units rather than a large, unending megapolis. So this was basically the
So
uh, garden city diagram. Yeah.
yeah, so I think if you compare this diagram to what we saw in the chapter last week, the city of bypass variegated, where there was unending suburban development. So cities just grew beyond their peripheries and spread endlessly, and there was suburbanization, which
Like
also
this.
destroyed nature. It was also speculative development, which completely took over the land and completely destroyed all its natural and ecological values. So this is that unplanned speculative development. When you look at Howard's diagram, he clearly talks about these small decentralized pockets or small towns which are limited in size, and the green belts are an important part of the garden city vision, where you have not just farms, but you have all kinds of parks and gardens and social amenities. So the natural values of the landscape are also kept intact.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Should I continue reading?
yeah.
Okay. So now so I think we've got a sense of the physical character. Don't mistake this for a concentric radial diagram. This is not what he imagined translated literally on the landscape. It was just a concept of, decentralized smaller towns which were connected by uh, mass transit and public transport networks. So, but it was more than just a physical blueprint. The final words under the third magnet, freedom, cooperation, are not just rhetoric, they are the heart of the plan. As Louis Mumford rightly says in his 1946 introduction to the book, Howard is much less interested in the physical forms than in social processes. The key was that citizens would own the land in perpetuity. The land for each garden city and its surrounding green belt, an area of 6,000 acres, that is 2,700 hectares, would be purchased in the open market at depressed agricultural land values of 40 pounds an acre to 100 pounds a hectare, or a pound or 240,000 pounds in all. The money raised on mortgage debentures, paying 4%. This land would be legally vested in 4 trustees. Soon, Howard argued, the growth of the garden city would raise land values and thus rents. Here was the innovative core of Howard's proposal. Rents could and would be regularly revised upwards, allowing the trustees to pay off the mortgage debt and then increasingly to generate a fund to provide a local welfare state. All this was embodied in yet another colored diagram in the first edition that was subsequently omitted with dire consequences to the understanding of Howard's message, entitled The Vanishing Point of Landlord's Rent. It illustrates how, as urban land values built up in Garden City, these would flow back to the community. In particular, they would make it possible to found pensions with liberty for our aged poor, now imprisoned in workhouses, to banish despair and to awaken hope in the breasts of those who have fallen, to silence the harsh voice of anger and awaken the soft notes of brotherliness and goodwill. Howard could thus
Okay.
argue that his was a third socio-economic system, superior both to Victorian capitalism and to bureaucratic centralized socialism. Its keynote would be local development and self-government. Services would be provided by the municipality or by private contractors as proved more efficient. Others would come from the people themselves in a series of what Howard called pro-municipal experiments. In particular, people would build their own homes with capital provided through building societies, friendly societies, cooperative societies, or trade unions. And this activity would in turn drive the economy. 40 years before John Maynard Keynes and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Howard had arrived at the solution that society could spend its way out of recession.
Did you want me to explain this part?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this is probably the most important part of Ebenezer Howard's proposal. And in fact, to appreciate what this means, you have to just look at your own city. Let's take the city of Bombay, for instance. The one of the key, the most important sources of inequality in urban life is the monopoly over the use and ownership of land. And you will find that, let's say, in the city of Bombay, land ownership is highly concentrated. Some people own a lot of land, and most people own none at all, right? And this is what actually is the founding basis for much of the inequality that we see. And now, why is that the case? Now, let's say you own a piece of land, in Malabar Hill. Okay, and you have owned it. It's an ancestral property. Probably you are a descendant of one of the early, you're a Koli, and you use that piece of land, and you had it, and then eventually now you own it. Okay, 400 years ago, that land had almost no value, and why? Because there was no city. So there was no demand for that land. There was not much productive use of that land. And so that land had no value at all. And now let's say for 400 years, you did nothing on the land. Okay, it's just a fenced up piece of empty, vacant plot, vacant property. Today, if you try to sell that land, you would be, even if you didn't try to sell it, basically you are a multi-billionaire, and without even moving a finger to do anything on that land. Now, why is that the case? That is simply because the surrounding areas have developed and become so productive that your land has become of incredible value. Now, the point is, for many socialists and for anarchists as well, this was what was the basis of injustice. If you don't do any productive activity in society, how come it is that you can become so rich? Just on account of the ownership of property or a means of production, right? So a lot of the early reformers, Ebenezer Howard included, thought about this problem as to how do you make um, wealth a factor of productive activity and not a factor of ownership. Hmm? And therefore, the garden city idea was based on a model where nobody would own any land in the city individually. The town dwellers, as a collective, would own all the land. Now, the way you would set this up is that you would probably buy a low-cost piece of land somewhere, an agricultural plot, large plot of land, which is large enough for a town, and this would be bought by all the people who are going to eventually live in it. So it's a trust. So you can think of it as a trust, and once or for instance, cooperative societies. It actually works on a similar model. If you are a resident of a cooperative society, you don't own the land in that society, right? You actually are a member of that society. And on account of being a member, you have the right to use that particular piece of land, right? Whereas in a private property system, you are the absolute owner of that piece of land, and therefore you can do whatever you want on it, right? So as a cooperative, the town would own all the land. Now, what happens is, as rents rise, as productive activity increases and rents rise, everybody would pay the same amount of rent on for the amount of land that they use. Okay, so think of it as a single rent that everybody pays for the land that they use. Now, this rent that is collected by the city then becomes the wealth for the city to invest in infrastructure, to invest in pensions, to give wages for all kinds of social use, right? So it becomes a kind of a so a cooperative socialist model of using the wealth that is produced in that society, and that wealth goes back and is invested in that society. Right now, just think about how the finances in Mumbai work. They don't work like this, right? Rents are not collected by the public authority. There is something called property tax, which is very, very, very less. If you are a rentier, if you live in the city on rent, you pay an exorbitant amount of rent to live on somebody else's property. Okay, that landowner, without doing any work, is actually earning rent on their property. It is on account of their ownership that they are making money, which means that the gap the gap between the landlords and the people who are rentiers, it goes on increasing, right? And so what you have is, and what eventually comes back to society. So how does the municipal corporation of Mumbai make money? It makes money by taxing goods and services. So earlier there was a system called octroi. So any goods entering the city would pay a certain kind of you know um, uh, 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 octroi or tax or whatever you want to call it, which would then become the wealth of the city, right? But land is not taxed. Neither is property taxed, unless except very marginally. Okay, so what happens as a result is that the people who own land do not have to. There is no way of redistributing the wealth in society. Whereas in Ebenezer Howard's cooperative model, everybody is paying in, contributing to the wealth of the society in proportion to the amount of use that they're putting its productive resources to, right? So this is the way in which the cooperative socialist model works, and this was the core of Ebenezer Howard's idea. Now, today, when you remember Ebenezer Howard, this part is conveniently forgotten. All that remains is that diagram, which suggests that Ebenezer Howard spoke about a radial concentric city. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just continue. I'll just complete that paragraph, and then we can move ahead. It would do so, however, without large-scale central state intervention. Howard's plan was to be realized through thousands of small-scale enterprises, every man, woman, a craftsman, and an entrepreneur. It would call, he said, for the very highest talents of engineers of all kinds, of architects, artists, medical men, experts in sanitation, landscape gardeners, agricultural experts, surveyors, builders, manufacturers, merchants, and financiers, organizers of trade unions, friendly and cooperative societies, as well as the very simplest form of unskilled labor, together with all those forms of labor of lesser skill and talent which lie in between. This is a peculiarly American vision, the homesteading spirit, brought back home to industrial England. But it is homesteading harnessed to the new technology to create a new socio-economic order, remarkable vision, not least for its startling modernity, even a century later. So this is, I think you all must have a good sense of what Howard was imagining by now. So we'll skip a few paragraphs. Basically, these talk about the first garden cities that got built in England, which is Letchworth and Hampstead. Hussein will later show you images of these or plans. What we'll move to now is to try and understand whether his vision actually got realized. And perhaps, I mean, like he says, that the Garden City has been one of the most influential ideas in planning, and it has, you see manifestations or, you know, the influences of this ideas all across the world across different continents. But he says that most of these ideas did not really take place, either because Howard's ideas were misunderstood, but also because of the practicality of implementing his ideas in the present capitalist model, because it was in a sense, a reconstruction of society. And it was very difficult for it, or impractical, or even seen as unprofitable to actually build cities the way Howard was imagining. So the world was still functioning in a capitalist model, and it didn't entirely implement Howard's ideas the way he imagined them, but they did use Howard's ideas, and most of these ideas, therefore, he says, have transmogrified. And you see many different kinds of manifestations of the garden city, which are not necessarily uh, entirely how he imagined them, but have definitely had roots in his ideology. So, Hussein, can you start reading from page 99? Shaw with
Okay.
his usual brilliance. Okay, so here we are referring to George Bernard Shaw, who was one of Ebenezer Howard's staunchest supporters. You all must know George Bernard Shaw, right? He's one of the uh, important literary figures and writers in London. And he is, yeah, so we begin with Shaw with his usual brilliance. He, in fact,
Yeah,
also
this is
questioned
page
and
102 in the
ideas, though he was Howard's supporters.
page 102. Yeah, Shaw, with his usual brilliance, had grasped the key point. As early as 1901, he wrote a letter to Neville in which he questioned whether capitalists would ever agree to a trust deed limiting their freedom. They might tolerate a maximum 5% dividend, but they would not distribute their profits. To realize the ideal, the only way might be to nationalize the garden city like the telegraphs and public roads. He was soon proved right. Letchworth was chronically undercapitalized. At the formal opening in 1903, only £40,000 out of a projected 300,000 had been subscribed, all by the directors. A year later, it was clear that firms were not being attracted. It was a major breakthrough when the printing and binding works of J.M. Dent, a major publisher, was attracted. In the first 2 years, only 1,000 residents arrived, and most were idealist, artistic folk who gave Letchworth a permanent reputation for crankiness that it later ill deserved. Here was the whole colony of eccentrics, making an exhibition of themselves rather too near our sacred borders. We wish they would remove their mad city a little nearer Arsley. Arsley was the local mental institution. That was doubtless overdone, but there were grounds for suspicion. At the cloisters, a residential college where residents slept on hammocks separated by canvas screens arranged in a horseshoe around a marble fountain, they grew wheat according to what was thought to be a Kropotkinist principle, each grain receiving individual attention. The result was mainly weeds and thistles. For a long time, it was not possible to build houses, shops, factories, or public buildings. No dividend was paid until 1913, and only at 1%, and then only at 1%. Soon the directors excluded Howard from any managerial function. Maybe he already realized that he was not cut out for the work. The directors, a constantly changing group, were nervous men, anxious for instant profitability and fearful of imminent collapse. In August 1905, after a little more than a year, they replaced Adams by W.E.H. Bond, manager of Trafford Park, and the kind of man who should have been appointed in the first place. Already there was no mention in the memorandum and articles of association of any legal obligation to transfer power progressively to the community. Then the directors faltered on the key issue of the gain in value to the community, and there was no compromise. Tenants would be offered a choice between a Howard lease with a 10, not 5-year revisions, and a normal 99-year fixed lease, most predictably settled on the second. Effectively, Howard and his central ideas were being eased out of the frame. Adams resigned from the board, probably because he opposed the new policy. As Robert Fishman has commented, instead of a peaceful alternative to capitalism, the Garden City became a device for preserving it. You want me to continue? Shweta, I think you're muted.
No, I'm saying continue unless you want to stop and explain, but otherwise you can just continue.
Yeah. The directors proved equally conservative on other matters. When in 1905 they gave away part of their proposed town center, a Buxton-style crescent for a cottage housing exhibition that was to become permanent, Raymond Unwin turned his energies to Hampstead Garden suburb. In fact, even this attempt was insufficient. It showed that houses could be built for as little as £150 and let at rents from 22 pence to 82 pence per week. But even this was too much for unskilled workers who had to find poorer housing outside the garden city. Ironically, the press saw them as more suited for weekenders than for the deserving poor, and the Manchester Evening Chronicle described middle class ladies gushing over them. What a darling wee little place! Oh, how too charming. Many of the first houses were built by speculative contractors with eccentric designs that Parker and Unwin had wanted to banish. Unwin did, however, remain consultant architect until dissolution of his partnership with Parker in May 1914. See brief Purdham's statement that Unwin, fighting a losing battle, fled during 1906 to Hampstead Garden suburb, and Letchworth hardly saw him again, was, it seems, a melodramatic overstatement. Soon, though, the original middle class eccentrics had been overwhelmed by the blue collar workers who were to provide the raison d'etre for the garden city's existence. But ironically, far from participating in the cooperative spirit of the enterprise, they embraced trade unionism and socialism. Many, in a development that had its own special irony, joined in commuters from neighboring Hitchin in the giant Australia, Australia factory to make corsets, which Letchworth women obviously never wear, but which their husbands sell at great profit to the less enlightened women in other towns. What survived from all this was, however, a watered down essence of the Harvard vision. The town began to pay dividends after a decade. It continued to grow more slowly than the promoters hoped, to reach 15,000, less than half of its planned target, in 1938. After World War II, aided by government subsidized decentralization schemes, it was last completed on a slightly smaller scale than originally planned. Ironically, at that point, it became the victim of land speculation, from which it was rescued by a 1962 Act of Parliament that put its management in the hands of a special corporation. Above all, it found its perfect physical realization in the hands of Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker. Almost too perfect, in fact. Unwin Parker architecture clothed the house skeleton so memorably that even after, people could hardly distinguish one from the other.
Yeah,
To
you can stop
understand
there,
what,
Hussain. Hussain? Yeah, you can
yeah,
stop there. You
okay.
want to explain this paragraph or it's clear enough?
No, I think it's clear enough. We can move on.
Okay, so I'll start reading the next part.
Yeah.
So I'm just skipping a few lines and I'm moving ahead on the same page. He and Parker shared the view that creativity came from an imaginative understanding. Did you find that? Just the next
No.
paragraph, midway through the next paragraph. Okay, I'll start reading. He and Parker, so we are talking about Unwin and Parker, who were the architects for these first garden cities of Letchworth and Hampstead. He and Parker shared the view that creativity came from an imaginative understanding of the past, that the Middle Ages provided a historic standard, that old buildings grew out of the ground they stood on, and that the village was an organic embodiment of the small, personally related community, that the architect and planner were guardians of social and aesthetic life, maintaining and enhancing the traditional values of the community for future generations. Unwin earlier early became a socialist in the William Morris tradition, joining the Sheffield group started by Edward Carpenter, a founder of the Fabian Society. Here, Kropotkin lectured on the union of craft and intellectual work. Before 1900, he was working on the design of cottages for mining villages in the local area. From this stemmed his book, Cottage Homes and Common Sense, an impassioned plea for better working class housing. It does not seem to be realized that hundreds of thousands of women spend the bulk of their lives with nothing better to look on than the ghastly prospect offered by these backyards, the squalid ugliness of which is unrelieved by the scrap of fresh green to speak of spring, or a falling leaf to tell of autumn. Yet, if instead of being wasted in stuffy yards and dirty back streets, the space which is available for a number of houses were kept together, it would make quite a respectable square or a garden. Cottages, each correctly oriented to give a sunny aspect to their chief room, would be planned around quadrangles opening one into the other after the manner of Oxford and Cambridge colleges. Already that year, Parker and Unwin were working on their first major commission, the garden village of New Yearswick for the Roundtree chocolate family, to be developed not as a charity but as an independent trust close to their factory on the northern edge of York. It contains in embryo many of the features that were to be worked out on a much larger canvas at Letchworth and then at Hampstead. The village is separated from the factory and from the city by a narrow but quite distinct green belt, part natural, part in playing fields. The cottages were disposed in terraces and grouped either around communal greens or along pedestrian ways, thus anticipating the Radburn layout by more than a quarter century. And later in the design process, cul-de-sacs, cul-de-sac, a village green and a folk hall are prominent central features. Everywhere, natural features, trees, a small brook are integrated into the design. It has in supreme measure what Parker and Unwin themselves called the first essential in the form and design of any decorative object, reposefulness. The visitor arriving in whatever state, psychological state, immediately receives a quite extraordinary impression of calm, of an informal but natural order of things, which is all pervasive, beautifully preserved, sympathetically restored to Unwin and Parker's original intention. New Year's Day is a small gem, dazzling to the eye at the age of 100. But in one respect only, it failed. The standards of design were so high, the lowest paid could not afford it. That indeed was to prove a recurrent defect. At Letchworth, they had a larger and more complex problem. For one thing, industry had to be integrated in with the housing. The fact that the railway line bisected the site determined that here the industry must be. As against New York's modest and rows of shops, the whole center had to be planned. Writing later in his great textbook of planning, Unwin enthusiastically, exhaustively analyzed the town plans of the past, concluding that both formal and informal approaches had their merits, though it was never in doubt that his case lay towards the informal. Letchworth also has more formal settlements in the form of radial avenues, bronze points, and above all, the big central town square, dominated by major municipal buildings. It does not work out right. The best of the informal housing layouts are as good as New Year's Week. Some planned around huge village green light spaces may be even better. And the Spirella factory is a joy, designed perhaps to avoid associations to the very pre-Viennese Jugendstil. But the town center is a terrible mess. The streets that seem to lead nowhere in particular, lined well after Unwin and Parker departed by an amorphous mixture of the worst interwar commercial, neo-Georgian, and even worse 60s tatty, all gone slightly to seed. Significantly, Unwin confesses that when designing it, he had not yet read Camilo Cite's book. I'm not going to pronounce that, published over a decade previously, with its stress on informal qualities of medieval cities. It was a lesson Unwin was not to forget. Town Planning in Practice, published in 1909, a mere decade late after Letchworth, is memorable above all for the brilliant lined old drawings of old English, French, and German towns and villages, from which he developed this understanding of the relationships of buildings and spaces, or rather their understanding together. Unwin and Parker raised the art of civic design to a level of pure genius, after which almost everything was pedestrian anticlimax. They were specific that their job, above all, was to promote beauty or amenity, terms which for them were interchangeable. Above all, we shall need to infuse the spirit of the artist into our work. But as well, their thoughts were always imaginatively with the people who would live in the buildings, walk or play in the spaces they created. And this went down to the minute particulars. Good architecture and planning for them was a multiplication of the right details. The children too must not be forgotten in the open spaces. The kinderbank or low seat to suit their short legs should always be provided. And where possible, spaces of turf be supplied with swings and seesaws, with ponds for sailing boats, and with sand pits where these can be kept sufficiently clean. They wanted to pursue social ends. Both in town and site planning, it is important to prevent the complete separation of different classes of people, which is such a feature of the modern English town. But in Edwardian England, there were limits. Both at Letchworth and at Hampstead, areas are shown for cottages, away from the grander middle class houses, close enough but not too close. Hampstead was a turning point both for English garden city movement in general and Unwin in particular, for it was self-confessedly not a garden city but a garden suburb. It had no industry, was openly dependent on commuting from an adjacent tube station, which opened just as it was being planned. In fairness and for historical record, it must be said that it was not the only one or even the first in this genre. Ealing Tenants Limited, the first London housing cooperative, had been founded in 1901 and brought to their 32-acre Brenton Estate site off Mount Avenue in 1902. Even before Letchworth, they had hired Unwin and Parker to design a model garden village by 1906, a year before the Hampstead Commission. It was a garden village suburb, different in scale from New Yearsville, distinguished by the high quality of its design, its inimitable feeling for peaceful domesticity, its central social club, a notion borrowed from New Yearsville, and indeed from the first garden suburb at nearby Bedford Park 30 years previously. Its proto-green belt formed by the meadows of the adjacent river Brent. Hussain, do you want to show some of the images of these two cities? First,
Letchworth and Hampstead.
yeah.
Okay, one second. Um, yeah. So, okay. All right. Well, yeah. Okay, you can see the screen, Shweta? Hello.
Yeah, we can see the presentation, yes.
Okay. So this is the Ebenezer Howard's three magnet. Hmm? And this is the suburbia, American suburbia that Shweta was describing. Here you have your Parker and Unwin's plan of the garden city, the original plan of the garden city. So as you can see, you have the solid black lines are basically the plot for the development, and the rest of the area is open and green. And as you can see, if you actually do a comparison of the built versus the unbuilt, you will see that the ratio is up, 70 unbuilt to about 30, maximum about 20 to 30% built, right? So this was broadly the idea of the garden city, where you have more land left open for recreational purposes as well as for nature. This is your hamster. This is hamster. Yeah.
Which
And
one is
you can
this,
also,
Hussain?
this is hamster. So, and you can
Hampstead.
also see that you have the roads, that the vehicular roads, and then through the large plot you also have small pedestrian pathways which are also tree lined. So it's like you walk through a garden to reach the the homes, the buildings, and the institutes. So you don't from the street, from the vehicular street, you don't directly enter the plot. You enter a garden, and you walk all the way to the particular institution that you're going to eventually wanting to go. It also has sketches of all the cottages that they designed.
Yeah, and see, when one sees this plan, one sees it's significantly different from the suburban development where there are these vehicular roads, and there's this endless monotonous development along vehicular roads, and with car traffic. Whereas here you see that they have experimented with
Whether you've gone somewhere. Hello, Shweta, are you mute? Shweta, you're mute.
Yeah, I was not mute. Okay, should I explain what I said again?
Yeah. Repeat what you were saying.
Yeah, so as I was saying that this development is significantly different, as we can see in this plan, it's significantly different from the image that Hussein showed earlier on the American suburbia, right? Because that has these endless vehicular roads, and there's monotonous, repetitive development, with houses along vehicular roads. So there's no understanding of the ecological context or no kind of imagination while planning that. It's more of speculative development which just takes over the land outside cities. Whereas here you see Raymond and Anvin have clearly planned this city, and one sees how the open spaces are organized. There are pedestrian routes to the open spaces. There's a segregation, attempts at segregation of vehicular and pedestrian movement entirely, which later we will look at in the Radburn plan in America also. But what one sees is that one also sees the informal layouts of the houses. The houses are not, it's not like a grid layout or monotonous housing blocks along endless,
Shweta, you're mute again. Unmute yourself.
yeah. Did you all hear what I was saying about the vehicular and pedestrian traffic?
Yeah, that we heard. We lost you when you said monotonous housing unit.
Yeah, who's muting me?
No, it happens on its own. There's some problem, a bug in the software.
So it's so this is clearly not like the monotonous housing that we see in American suburbia where you have endless repetitive houses along vehicular roads. One sees that it is carefully planned with clear segregation or separation of vehicular and pedestrian traffic. One also sees that the open spaces are organized like green belts. There is if one looks at the plan and the layout of the buildings, one sees that they are again not these endless monotonous blocks that come up, randomly along roads, but there is a clear design, and this has clearly been influenced by the medieval historical cities. And Raymond and Unwin clearly had a preference for the informal kind of character of planning as opposed to formal radiating or grid layouts. So one sees that reflected clearly in these plans because that is what they associated with, the creation of good and aesthetic environments.
Yeah, one other contrast that you see with the suburb, and this is an important distinction, is that the suburban layout, the American suburban layout, is basically a layout for single family homeowners. So what happens is that the way in which it is planned, even the process of development is very different. This particular one of Hampstead, it is planned as an integrated whole. Whereas what happens in the suburban layouts is that it is basically a network of vehicular roads and plots, which are then handed over to different architects and owners to develop for their own homes with a certain kind of minimal bylaws which will regulate the amount of building and so forth. But the idea here is that it is designed as a larger civic monument, not as speculative, as Shweta mentioned, not as speculative interventions by different homeowners, right? So you can have housing here. Many of these blocks are actually housing, but uh, they come out of a certain kind of a coherent urban vision, not not the ever growing need for selling land and then developing housing units. So
Yeah,
the
not, it's not
process of
just
planning and
subdivision of
development
land and
also.
allotments. It's
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so, Shweta, you want me to show them also the German idea?
No, I think we'll just come to that. What I'll do is, I just want to finish this paragraph that I was reading. It has this last bit about this kind of, group housing and cooperative housing. So here, clearly, there are individuals' houses and cottages. But I'll just continue. Ealing is interesting for more than design, though. It represents the way that garden cities and garden suburbs were supposed to be built. Howard's freedom and cooperation in action. Unwin had commended cooperative housing in a pamphlet of 1901, arguing that this way groups of prospective owners could get housing at low cost on land bought at farm value. Howard's argument again, but additionally, the houses could be grouped together and so arranged that each could obtain a sunny aspect and open outlook, and portions of the land could be reserved forever from being built on to secure these views. And common rooms could be provided for music and general recreation, and also for meals. Groups of houses, he suggested, could be developed around quadrangles, each with a common room, the quintessence of that medieval spirit of community that Unwin so earnestly wanted to recapture. Unwin sat on the executive committee of the co-partnership Tenants Housing Company. He and Parker developed not only Ealing but also the suburbs outside Leicester, Cardiff, and Stoke-on-Trent. In 1909, Housing and Town Planning Act allowed such public utility services societies to borrow money at low rates of interest, and by 1918, there were more than 100 of them. But the Treasury resisted a clause which would have allowed them to borrow money on the same terms as local authorities, and this constrained them as local housing development agencies. So here we are talking about a model. I think you all must have. I think Hussain, isn't this similar to the model we had in Bombay, the cooperative housing societies?
Yeah, yeah.
So housing in Bombay at one point was not built by developers or solely developers. You all must be aware of many cooperative housing societies in Bombay where people themselves raised the money, brought land at low value, and then were allowed to build housing. But in England, like he said, they were not. They should have been allowed to borrow the money on the same terms as the local authorities, and this became a constraint in more such developments taking place. Okay. All right. So now we are uh, we are going to skip the next
Purva,
part.
can you share your screen again? Hello, Purva, are you there?
How much time do we have, Hussain? Like we are still in
We
time,
have
or
another. No, no, we have 20, 25 minutes now. So that we can
that's
also
it?
have some time for the presentation.
Okay. Okay. So I think I'm just wondering, could we continue over next class?
This same chapter.
Or at least like what's left of it. Like it won't be maybe the entire class, but
Okay. So I think.
once.
Hello. Hello. Shweta, you're mute again. Hello?
There was some disturbance. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just saying that can we continue a bit, or can it spill over into the next class, or should we just finish whichever parts we finished?
It can, but I think we can skip some of the intermediate parts and go, because we also have the presentation, so we can show the slides and explain some of the things, and we can ask. I mean, hopefully, students will read it again, read
Okay.
it
So
themselves.
I think let's just move to the presentation then, and then I'll give some inputs and I'll read parts which are relevant to the presentation. Let's do it like that.
Okay, fine. So I will go and share my screen again.
Can you do the presentation?
Yeah. All right. So this is Hampstead, as we explained already. Yeah. So this is actually a very interesting diagram, which is a kind of a modernist interpretation of the garden city. Can anybody guess who the architect is of this diagram? Have you seen it before? No? No guesses? All right. So this is actually a diagram prepared by Walter Gropius. And this is a rendering of how a garden city idea can be incorporated within a modernist form of planning. Hmm? And if you see the study, it's very interesting. What he's trying to do, what Gropius is trying to do, is actually design. Today when you do this stuff, you call it climatology. For Unfortunately, you call it that, and sometimes you make certain kind of sun diagrams and things like that. Actually, um, this is exactly that, but it is done much more elegantly than as it's done these days. As you can see, what he's studying is the way in which the building, the amount of building can be organized, um, and there is a relationship between the height of the building and the distance between buildings. So if you build lower, build 1 or 2 stories, you can have many more rows of building. As you increase the height of the building, the distance between them keeps increasing, so as to ensure that when even when the sun is not at its highest, all the different rooms in the house get direct sunlight. So this is how it is organized. Now we will see later how this was also interpreted for Mumbai by the Improvement Trust. But this is an important diagram as to how the modernist architect who in a sense shunned Raymond and Unwin's vernacular kind of interpretation of the garden city, and brought it more into modernist language. Hmm. This is your Shraddha, you want to talk about this? This is the Margaret Hemhoe.
Yeah. Okay, so here I'd just like to. I think many of these case studies, I think the ones that Hussain is showing, are explained in this chapter. But essentially, there are like here I think there's one section where he then moves on to talk about the garden city in Europe, right? So apparently there were many influences, and in fact there were many. He talks about how the idea in this process, this idea got transmogrified, and many different people started using it and interpreting it in different ways. And each he says that in the several countries that it went to, each had a homegrown garden city advocate like Howard. So there was this kind of linear development that was advocated by this Spanish engineer Arturo de Soria, where there were linear roads along which you had decentralized development. Similarly, what Hussein is showing here is this development in Germany, and it was a site where it was built by the Krupp family. And here clearly it was this industrial city. So this is very much a place where, in like one realizes that later when the garden city idea was applied, it was not essentially the way Howard imagined it. Like Howard was imagining industrial kind of this decentralized cities with industries which were also located there. So he was imagining this decentralization or this movement of industries also from outside of the big cities. But in many places, the garden city just became like a add-on or a dormitory suburb, where although the town was moved outside the city, you had networks of public transport and people would still travel to the city for work. So they were still dependent on the city. And so then the garden city was actually transformed into this idea of a garden suburb. But in this particular development in Germany, one sees that it was actually promoted by the left-wing German garden city movement, and the workers' interests and their it were given a priority here. And here it was developed by an industrial family. So it shows how the Krupp family was a brilliant. It was an example of German industrial paternalism. So he explained this city. I think, Hussein, do you want me to read out, or it's better to just explain?
I think they can read it again, because we'll leave this
Yeah,
presentation
I
on
what
the.
we'll do is we'll just go through these examples and speak a little bit about them. But it might be interesting for you all to actually look at these plans. In fact, the book does not have all the plans, but then if the plans are not available, to Google these, because many of these are very interesting case studies of how the garden city has been implemented in various countries across the world, like in Spain, in Paris, in New Zealand, even in Japan, and later the Radburn plan in America, which was actually about that pedestrian layout with cul-de-sacs. So there were different ways in which it kind of, changed and, was transformed, and different ways in which it got implemented, sometimes by private developers. In this case, it was the industrialist families. It was also an effort of, municipal development. But later in America, you also had this large-scale nationalization of land and the acquisition of land for creating public housing, projects in these garden cities. Of course, it wasn't successful. You want to go to the next image, Hussein?
Yeah. This is your forest hills. Forest hills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, can I see? Wait, can you just? Which one is it?
Forest hills. So actually, with the forest hills, this plan, you see more or less the emergence of the American suburban model, more and more, where you have these plots. So you see, I mean, this is not really a plan, right? It's a kind of a layout. And the expectation is in contrast to the Unwin plan, which had the locations of the buildings and the uses and everything predetermined. In this, what you see is a organization of plots, and then each of these plots would then be sold to an individual owner, and and a single family home would be built on it. So this is the gradual transformation of some of the early garden city idea into the garden suburb layout. This is what is happening in the forest park example. Did I want to add? Hello? Tata, you must be mute.
So there were three ideas that emerged in America, like which were related to the garden city, but they were not entirely a part of Howard's idea. One is this idea of a parkway. The second is the Radburn layout, which is the pedestrian layout where pedestrian and vehicular traffic is segregated. I'm muted again. Yeah, where
Even I was
pedestrian and
muted.
vehicular traffic is segregated. But this layout is actually something that is called in American planning as the neighborhood plan, where all the it's basically planned for a certain population, and it has a school and various amenities, and all these amenities are in walking distance of each other. And what's most important about this plan is, yeah, reserved for a possible school site. You see that? And what's most important about the plan is the public square, where you have a memorial monument, a bandstand, an ornamental fountain. So this is Forest Hills Park, which is an example of neighborhood planning in America, which is also one of the manifestations of the garden city idea. You want to move to the next image?
Yeah. This is Radburn.
I can't see. It's not come to Radburn yet.
Yeah. Wait, it will come. Can you see it now? Can you see it?
No, I think it's still the earlier one.
No, I have changed the screen. Maybe there's some lag.
Okay. Yeah,
Just,
I'm still
wait for,
seeing the earliest.
Still not come.
No, not yet.
1 second. I'll just reshare the screen. You can see it now.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see it now.
Yeah. I'll just zoom in.
Okay. So guys, can you see this layout?
Yeah, I think if you can see it, I hope they can see it also.
Yeah. So this is the Radburn layout where the vehicular and pedestrian movement is completely segregated. You also have features such as these, cul-de-sacs for vehicular traffic so that you don't have in between the houses. Can you see that?
1 second, I'll zoom in. Do you see the zoomed in image?
Okay, so I'll just read from the book which describes this layout. The hierarchical arrangement of roads, here used for the first time, although almost immediately copied by Parker at Wythenshawe, is very natural and easy. The houses, modest enough in themselves, cluster cosily along short cul-de-sacs from the distributor roads, a motive borrowed directly from Unwin and Parker at Hampstead and later at New Yearswick, as time freely acknowledged. Obscured by the rich New Jersey summer vegetation, they look almost as if they grow out of the ground. The central open space with its serpentine pedestrian and bicycle paths under rusticated overbridges has an informal naturalness. It looks and feels right. So you all see the Radburn layout. So this was also replicated in various places, and again the Radburn influence has been also then used in Europe. So you find even in Europe some of the garden cities were then planned according to the Radburn layout. Want to move to the next example?
Yeah, this is your lineal gardens. You can see it.
Okay.
This is Siddharthan linear.
Yeah, so this is what this is an interpretation in Paris, where you see 1 second. There's a Spanish engineer, Arturo Soria y Mata, who conceived of his ideal La Cinda lineal in a magazine article in 1882 and developed it into a detailed proposal in 1892. the essence is that of a tramway or a light rail system running out from the big city would give extraordinary linear accessibility, which would permit the development of a planned linear garden city. The linear garden city, however, was never more than a commuter suburb, and it developed as a commercial speculation. So, again, this was not really the decentralized garden city that Howard was imagining, but it was a linear interpretation, which was nothing more than a dormitory suburb for the city. Okay, we move to the next one.
Yeah. So this one
So I
actually
think,
is Shweta, bol.
yeah, actually, it might be good if you all can, since we have limited time in class, it might be good for you all to read the chapter in more detail and see each of these case studies, because one also sees a more modernist interpretation of the garden city plan, where it's not the kinds of cottages and individual houses that were imagined by Parker and Unwin in England. Also not similar to the Radburn layout. One also sees in Germany, for instance, the development of apartment buildings or apartment blocks, modernist apartment blocks, which also, was a different interpretation of the garden city idea. And many of these, this kind of imagination that apartment blocks do not work in a garden city is completely, proved untrue, because in Germany you also have examples of very good low-rise linear, low rise housing, which has been built in lush vegetation. So it's not like apartments are contrary to the idea of the garden city. And what Hussein is showing here is something which we see in Mumbai. It is one of the interpretations of the garden suburb in Mumbai, where you also have the construction of apartments in colonial Bombay. You want to explain
Yeah.
this, Hussein?
Yeah. Yeah. So how did the Garden City come to Bombay? Um, Actually, it's the origins of the Garden City idea in Bombay are very interesting because it has less to do with the kind of squalor and industrial pollution, which was what it was a reaction to in Europe, but it was more a reaction to the epidemic outbreak. And Bombay had seen many frequent epidemics, cholera being an important one, but it was the bubonic plague in 1896 which really changed the way in which city planning, in fact, introduced for the first time urban planning at a public scale in the city of Bombay. Now, what actually happens is that uh, it also the interesting history a bit about this is also that it comes out of a kind of a strange error of interpretation of the disease itself. You see, the epidemic, I mean, you're seeing, for instance, right now as we are facing the COVID pandemic, that a lot of the blame for the spread of disease is being made on the settlements of the poor. For instance, with the COVID, there was a lot of talk until recently about how Dharavi and other slums in Bombay are going to, create the epidemic hotspots, and they are the ones that these are the settlements where it will be very difficult to control the breakout and so forth, right? Now, similarly, when the plague happened, obviously at that point in Bombay, the conditions of sanitation for a majority of the native dwellers or the Indian part of the city was extraordinarily deplorable. In fact, there was no sanitation at all except by manual scavengers. Um, uh, uh, what you When the plague broke out, it was predictably blamed on the dirty native habits or the lack of sanitary behavior on the part of the native population. Um, it was also understood as being a result of the way in which development in the inner city of Bombay had happened. which had no regard for any kind of sanitary norms. And sanitary norms meaning distances between buildings, or the size of openings, or the width of streets or open space, and so on. Now what also happened is that when the BIT was set up, the Bombay Improvement Trust, the bureaucrats obviously of the BIT, the lead ones, were predictably influenced by the Garden City movement in the UK, and so many of those ideas kind of percolated in. Now, when the plague happened, it was interpreted as a result of the lack of. I mean, there was a theory of why plague spread in Bombay, and it was that bad air, or polluted air, or air which had which is called miasma theory. The idea that bad air is the cause of plague. Actually, it was a thoroughly outdated idea from a medical perspective, because everybody knew by then that the plague was caused by pests, rodents, and the flea, and it was that it was caused by germs, not by bad air. However, the bad air theory kind of stuck, and very soon there was a very powerful reform crusade by the Bombay Improvement Trust to improve the sanitary conditions of the buildings and the inner city, the native town of Bombay. Now, the way in which the BIT introduced this was by introducing sanitary building codes. And you saw the diagram that I showed you of Walter Gropius, of the ratio of the relationship between building heights and distances between buildings. A similar interpretation in the case of Bombay. Now, Walter Gropius is obviously making that diagram for Europe, where the sun, even even mid afternoon, is fairly low in the sky. Bombay is a tropical city. It's a different kind of climate, and so you get direct sunlight almost overhead, right? So, but still, it had to be there has to be a relationship between building heights and the distances between buildings. And so the Bombay Improvement Trust promoted what they called the 63.5-degree rule, which meant that if you draw a line from the base of one building at an angle of 63.5 degrees, the next building, the top of the next building should not be inside that particular line, right? So this was basically the 63.5-degree rule, which the Bombay Improvement Trust introduced in Bombay. Now, interestingly, what happened was that the landlord of the city, who did not like the 63.5-degree rule, because it would mean that they could build much less than they had already built, um, rejected the idea, and they actually clamored against it, and they organized against it, and they protested, and they used the municipal corporation, which was predominantly controlled by landlords at that point, to restrict the introduction of these bylaws in the most congested parts of the city. So what you got at that point was there were two kinds of bylaws in Bombay. One for the inner city, which did not follow the 63.5-degree rule, which followed the old municipal bylaws, and the new parts of the city which were not yet developed, where they would then apply the 63.5-degree rule, right? And so what resulted was, this is the, can you see this map? Sweta, can you see it? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So when the BIT started planning its suburbs, the colonial suburbs of what today we know as Dadar Parsi colony and Hindu colony and so forth, these these followed the 63.5-degree rule and garden city planning ideas. Obviously, these were not meant for working class people. These were designed for middle class people. And it was designed as a way of giving middle class people sanitary housing in the city of Bombay, right? So much of these lands were earlier agrarian lands. They were taken up. This was a town planning scheme model where all of these lands were assembled. They were the streets were planned and so forth, and then the owners of the land were given back planned plots. So that is how they could then sell their plots, which were smaller in size now, but still higher in value. And so the landowners were happy. The state was happy because they could do planned development, um, and you would get sanitary housing in the city. Now, if you look at some of these sections, you remember last time we spoke about the street section in these garden suburbs, which had carriageway, as you can see, lined with rows of trees, and the mass transit, the tramway in the middle. This is why the we see in this part of the city are so bright. And if you actually in and today, if you look at the layout of the garden suburb in Dadar Matunga and area, earlier the effectively the FSI for each of the plot was one. So you could build only on one third of the plot, and you could build a maximum of 3 stories, which means that the FSI is roughly one. Later, they added a little bit of FSI. They made it 1.33, which meant that the residents of these suburbs could add another story on their existing building. That is the reason why you have this odd 1.33 FSI in the island cities, and at least you had it till the new development plan happened. But this is basically the story of the Dadar Parsi colony, and this is how the Garden City came into the city of Bombay. Yeah. Sita, you want to add something to this? You're mute. Sita, you mute again.
Okay. Are you done with the presentation or there's more?
Yeah. That was the last slide. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just like to, like, now that Hussain has talked about the garden suburbs, it was not really the Howard's imagination of the garden city, right? Because it did.
Mute again. Mute again. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I think Hussain just talked about the.
Again you're muted. Why is this happening? I have no idea.
Who's muting me? Okay. Should I start?
Hello.
Hussain?
Yeah. I'm
Should I
somebody.
start?
Yeah. Start.
Repeatedly. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Continue.
yeah. So I think in Hussein's last slide, he shows the development of Dadar Parsi colony and Hindu colony, the first garden suburbs, which was again post-industrial development in Bombay. It was to decongest the city. New lands in the peripheries of the island city, towards the north of the island city, that is Dadar and Vadala and Sion and those areas, was acquired by the British government, and the Bombay Improvement Trust constructed this suburban housing, where again it was again there was income segregation, and you had the elite colonies. There was also the BDD chawls which got built, but the idea was again influenced by Howard's idea of the garden city, but it is not really the garden city, because Howard essentially was imagining decentralized communities where even the industries, so the garden city in Bombay is like an extension. It's like the suburbs to the industrial development, right, at that time, which was Girangaon and Lower Patti, and all the congested suburban areas. So it's not entirely a decentralized city. It is a suburb to the existing city. There is also one also sees that there is no industrial development or employment in the garden city, which is outside. So one sees that when this idea gets transported to different places, in most cases, it has been interpreted as the garden suburb. And one sees that it's an extension to the existing city, a more green extension with more green belts and open spaces, parkways, etc. in America that get interpreted and designed as, influenced on the lines of the Garden City, but it's not essentially that. Another critical aspect there to point out is that Howard has also originally imagined that the communities would be built by the cities would be built by communities themselves. Essentially, he was imagining people themselves to, it to be more entrepreneurial, where people themselves go and buy land and set up industry, and people themselves move there and build their own housing. And somehow he was also imagining these to be locally governed by a welfare state, which would also be funded by the development of land and the development of the city itself. So these were more like self-governing and, based on the welfare state model. What one sees, and I think even George Bernard Shaw had clearly pointed out that that model was not really easy to implement in the present capitalist system that we were already in, and it would have meant that they also needed to transform or change the entire system. So what eventually happened is that very few entrepreneurs or profit-making industrialists were likely to go and buy land at that scale, because it meant a restriction or a limitation on their profits. And George Bernard Shaw said that this model of the Garden City is difficult to realize without having a more state control, or the local authorities or local bodies themselves going and acquiring this land. And what we see in Bombay is again the state acquisition of land by the Bombay Improvement Trust to, for the construction of the suburbs. Similar in America, we also see this kind of nationalization of land. There was one attempt to build public housing, so Garden City model where the state acquires land and builds public housing. It's surprising that in Europe, this model was initially developed by private, parties, even in England especially. And in Europe, you see smaller municipal authorities or industrial families developing this model. So the first model that was built by state authorities entirely was in America. So that was surprising, considering the kind of market-driven capitalist development one finds there. And that model was not really successful. Similarly, in England, you had the town planning movement and you had the development of new towns outside of cities. I think we discussed this in the last chapter when we talked about, suburbanization and the development of new towns outside England. So this was again a garden suburb, not really, built along Howard's lines. I will just read the last paragraph of his conclusion. One can't say that the new towns were not entirely similar to the Garden City, and they were also thought of as dreary and monotonous. But it's not that they were not entirely successful. When in 1979, a Milton Keynes community television station announced as an April Fool joke that the entire new town would be plowed into the ground, a viewer declared that he would not go back to London. Milton Keynes has given him a garden, something he never had before, and he was damned if he was going to give it up now. The new towns are still rather good places to work and to live. The best thing that can be said about them is that half a century later, the first of them was started. They are almost completely non-newsworthy. The media notice only when, on rare occasions when, like the Guardian in August 1986, they want to write about a place without problems. But in the wider view, Howard's original vision is still not to be found. The shell is there, but not the substance. These are not anarchist, self-governing commonwealths of free artisans in them. The link is missing between industry and land. The rich cooperative life, recapturing the traditions of the Middle Ages, is nowhere to be seen. Perhaps it was a chimera from the start. Perhaps if all this ever was a faint hope, the realities of the late capitalist economy and the post-industrial society have finally dashed it. But in order to judge that better, it would be necessary to understand that there was yet a further and even more radical stand for the city, which requires another chapter.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. So should we end? I think.
Yeah. So I
Are there
think
any questions?
yeah. So next week we are doing the next chapter, which is Shraddha, city in the region.
In the,
Hello.
yeah.
Yeah, it's city in the region, right?
Hmm.
Okay. So please read the next chapter and come. We are going to be discussing um, uh, going to be like this today we focused largely on Ebenezer Howard. The next week is going to be focused mainly on the work of Patrick Geddes. And Patrick Geddes is a very interesting character in our story. So please read the chapter before you come. Also read the Garden City chapter once again. I will put this presentation, the slideshow up on the group so you can refer to some of the plans as you read the chapter.
But there are
And
many
also,
other examples, Hussain, in the chapter, in the
uh,
Garden City chapter. There are many good examples and case studies which we were not able to elaborate on, and those have been described in his chapter. So it might be nice to even look up the plans for those case studies because they're very different and interesting efforts in planning. One sees how one idea gets transported in different locations and completely transforms, how one
yeah.
thinks about
So
planning.
please do your own reading up and your own research while you're reading the chapter, and then we'll see
One
you next
person has
week. All
raised
right?
their hand.
Yeah. Bolo,
Someone, who's that?
please raise the hand.
Somebody has raised their hand.
Second, I can't see the hand anymore. Accidentally. Okay, fine. ठीक है. Chalo, then see you guys next week. Have a good week. Take care. And yeah, please
And you
read and
can
come.
just like type your questions. I think we didn't have enough time for questions or comments. So I think you all can read the chapter, type your observations or questions on the group. So, there can be some food for
Discuss
discussion.
this. Yeah. All right, guys. Bye. Take care.